The lights in the business class cabin gleamed like polished silver. Crystal glasses chimed softly as passengers lifted their wine, the scent of seared steak mingling with the perfume of luxury. It was the sort of space where comfort was crafted to feel like superiority. Every plate arriving was a performance, cuts of beef resting beside roasted vegetables, glasses of deep red poured with a flourish, the promise that every detail carried dignity. Then came the silence that shifted everything. The flight attendant approached Julian Hart and Caleb Monroe, who had settled into their seats with quiet anticipation. Their hands brushed, fingers resting together on the armrest as they waited like everyone else. But instead of the ritual of silverware and wine, a tray clattered down in front of them. Plastic, cheap, the kind of thing you would find in the back row of a budget flight. On it sat a single roll of cold bread. The flight attendant's voice carried sharp enough for the nearest rows to hear. "This meal is more suitable for the two of you." The sound was small, just a few words, but it cut through the air like a blade. A woman across the aisle lowered her fork mid-bite. A man with a glass of Cabernet paused before it touched his lips. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade beneath the sting of those words. Julian felt Caleb stiffen beside him, his partner's jaw tightening, breath sharpened in his chest. Julian's hand found Caleb's under the thin blanket draped across their laps. His fingers pressed firm, a silent plea to hold steady. Inside him burned a storm. They had worked hard for these seats. They had paid, just like every other passenger in this shining space. But in an instant, what should have been a shared privilege had been twisted into a public humiliation. Julian's throat ached with words he wanted to throw back. But he knew what was at stake. Not just pride, not just anger. It was the reminder of every glance they had endured, every muttered remark, every door closed without explanation. Tonight, the insult had taken the shape of a cold bun on a plastic tray, a spectacle made of their love. Caleb's eyes flicked toward him, furious and wounded at once. The room remained frozen. No one dared speak. No one dared stand. But everyone was watching. Julian inhaled through clenched teeth, forcing himself to stay still, to swallow back the shout clawing at his chest. He had promised himself long ago never to give prejudice the satisfaction of breaking him in public. And yet, in that cabin filled with chandeliers of light and polished steel, he felt like a boy again, cornered and diminished simply for existing. The cruel truth was clear. A meal that should have been a symbol of indulgence had been turned into a weapon. Their presence, their love, was being marked as less, and in the way the other passengers looked away, in the way silence filled the air. Julian knew this was not just about food. It was about who was seen as worthy of dignity and who was not. Moments like these remind us why respect is not a luxury. It is the foundation every person deserves. To strip someone of it in plain sight is to expose the fault lines of prejudice still woven into places meant to feel untouchable. Julian sat taller in that seat, the bread untouched, the plastic tray shining under the cabin lights like evidence of a crime. He would not let the moment define him, even as it left its scar. If you believe that dignity belongs to everyone, that no one should be shamed for who they love, then you are already part of this story. Follow Hart stories, because these are not just tales told in passing, they are truths that remind us who we are when the world chooses to look away. Julian Hart lifted his gaze from the untouched bread and spoke with the calmness of someone who refused to surrender his dignity. His tone was measured, his words carefully chosen, but the weight behind them carried the exhaustion of years. He asked the attendant a simple question: why? Why? When every other seat was being served on china, did their tray arrive in plastic? The attendant's face remained stiff, his posture rigid as if formality could shield him from the truth of his actions. His reply cut colder than the bread itself. Business class is reserved for those who truly belong here. Perhaps the two of you are confused about where that is. The words were flat, dismissive, and loud enough for the nearest rows to hear. Caleb Monroe reacted before thought could catch him. He pushed back his seatbelt and rose, the fury in his chest spilling into his voice. His hands trembled as he pointed at the untouched tickets, still tucked neatly into the seatback pocket. "We paid in full," he said, his voice cracking under the strain. "You are treating us differently because of who we are." The sting of humiliation was written in his eyes, a storm that mirrored every time the world had cornered him into defending the right to exist. Around them, the cabin shifted uneasily. A woman discreetly angled her phone, recording from the safety of her row. Another passenger leaned into the aisle, curiosity pulling stronger than discomfort. But many others looked away, burying themselves in their screens or wine glasses, eager to pretend nothing was happening. The silence of bystanders became its own betrayal, echoing louder than any insult. The attendant leaned closer, his voice a whisper sharpened into a threat. "If you cannot prove your tickets, you will be escorted off this plane." His eyes narrowed with the satisfaction of power, the quiet relish of someone certain he could strip them of their place. The plastic tray still sat between them, a mocking emblem of the message he was sending less than unworthy, intruders in a space bought with their own sacrifice. Caleb's chest heaved, rage pulling at every fiber of his being. He wanted to shout, to throw the tray back into the aisle, to demand that the world stop pretending prejudice was anything but deliberate cruelty. But Julian's hand found his wrist, steady and grounding. Julian knew too well that anger would be twisted against them, that a single outburst would feed the very narrative waiting to brand them as the problem. He whispered nothing, only gave a look that begged Caleb to hold the line, to remember that sometimes dignity was the only shield they had. The moment stretched unbearably. Passengers shifted in their seats, some watching with pity, others with discomfort, but no one intervened. The isolation pressed like weight upon their shoulders, reminding them how fragile equality could feel even in a cabin designed for comfort. Caleb lowered himself back into his seat, the fire in his eyes banked but not extinguished. Julian straightened his posture, meeting the attendant's gaze without a word, refusing to bend beneath the insult. The scene painted more than humiliation. It revealed the fragility of justice when silence surrounds cruelty. It showed how prejudice thrives, not only in the words of those who wield it, but in the inaction of those who witness it. And in that cabin, filled with privilege and comfort, the sharpest reminder was delivered not by the bread on the tray, but by the choice of others to pretend nothing had happened. Education begins in moments like these, where injustice hides behind uniforms and rules. When the cost of speaking up feels heavier than silence, the lesson is not just about tolerance, it is about courage. To look away is to side with cruelty, but to stand with dignity is to challenge the world to change. Julian knew this truth, even as his heart burned with restraint. He chose silence not out of weakness, but out of strategy, saving strength for a battle that was still unfolding. The air inside the cabin felt frozen, not by temperature, but by shame and silence. Caleb Monroe sat rigid in his seat, his fists pressed hard against his knees. Julian Hart held his composure, but his jaw was clenched tight, the cords in his neck taut like wire. The flight attendant hovered over them, the faintest trace of triumph etched in the curl of his lips. Around them, the other passengers wrestled with discomfort, some stealing glances, others retreating into the safety of pretending it wasn't their problem. It was then that the sound of a seatbelt unclasping broke the quiet. From 3 rows ahead, a man in his 50s rose slowly. His suit was not designer, his shirt not pressed to perfection. He wore the kind of clothes that allowed him to blend in among ordinary travelers. Yet as he stepped into the aisle, his presence carried a gravity that filled the space. He looked directly at the attendant, his voice low but edged with steel. "That will be enough." The words cut through the cabin sharper than any shout. The attendant stiffened, caught off guard, but tried to recover with forced authority. "Sir, please return to your seat. This matter is under control." His voice wavered at the end, betraying nerves he could no longer hide. The man moved closer, his gaze unwavering. His name, though still unspoken, was Richard Morrison. He studied the tray on Julian's table, the untouched bread, the cheap plastic glinting under cabin lights. He turned back to the attendant, his tone cold with indignation. Under control, what I just witnessed was a customer being humiliated in front of an entire cabin. His voice carried, commanding the silence of every passenger who now leaned forward to listen. The attendant faltered, his throat bobbing as he struggled for a defense. "I was only following policy," he began, but Richard cut him off with a firmness that left no room for evasion. "Policy does not excuse cruelty. It does not authorize you to strip paying passengers of their dignity." The tension thickened. The attendant's mask of authority crumbled. He stammered, words tumbling out in desperation. "I didn't mean this was just..." But before he could finish, Richard reached into his jacket and drew out a card. He held it between two fingers, raised just high enough for the nearest rose to see. His next words shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. "My name is Richard Morrison," he said with quiet finality. "I am the CEO of Morrison Airlines, and I just watched one of my employees commit blatant discrimination in my cabin." A ripple swept through the rows. Gasps, whispers, the sudden realization that the ordinary man now standing in the aisle was the highest authority the airline possessed. The attendant's face drained of color. His hands twitched nervously at his sides. His earlier confidence shattered. "Sir, please. I can explain." "You cannot explain away prejudice," Richard replied, his voice steady and merciless. "You have not only humiliated these two men, you have humiliated this company. You have undermined every promise we make to our passengers." He let the silence settle like judgment. "You are finished. As of this moment, you are dismissed from service." The attendant's lips parted as if to beg, but no words came. His shoulders sagged under the weight of public disgrace. He turned toward the galley, treading with small, hurried steps, as though trying to shrink from the eyes that now pierced him from every direction. Julian and Caleb exchanged a look, one part relief, one part disbelief. The storm that had been building inside them finally found release not in their voices, but in the intervention of a man who had chosen to stand. The plastic tray still lay between them, but now it was transformed from a symbol of insult into evidence of the cruelty that had been exposed. Richard lingered a moment longer, scanning the cabin, his presence commanding every glance. Then he lowered his voice, speaking not only to the couple but to every silent witness who had sat frozen until now. "What you tolerate in silence, you endorse. Remember that." It was more than a rebuke. It was a lesson carried on the quiet hum of the engines, a reminder that prejudice is not defeated by discomfort, but by courage. For Julian and Caleb, the night had already carved itself into memory. Yet for the passengers who had watched, the shame of their stillness would echo long after the plane touched the ground. The silence that followed Richard Morrison's declaration lingered like a heavy curtain. The dismissed attendant had disappeared into the galley, but the residue of his cruelty remained in the untouched tray on Julian Hart's table. The cabin seemed to exhale as though releasing a breath it had been holding too long. Some passengers shifted uneasily. Others stared down at their plates. But all of them knew they had just witnessed something that went far beyond an airline meal. Richard turned toward Julian and Caleb Monroe, his expression softening from the steel that had stripped the attendant of authority. He reached out, steadying himself against the headrest in front of their row, and bowed his head ever so slightly. "On behalf of this airline," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed cabin, "I want to apologize. You deserve respect, not humiliation. What happened here does not reflect the values we claim to uphold." Julian felt his throat tighten. He had prepared himself for further insults, for isolation, for being forced to swallow the indignity in silence. What he had not expected was this: an apology offered not behind closed doors, but under the scrutiny of every passenger in business class. Caleb placed his hand over Julian's, the tension between them softening into something heavier than anger relief mixed with recognition. Richard continued, his gaze fixed on Julian as though speaking to him alone. "You carried yourself with dignity, even as you were provoked. You did not allow someone else's hatred to define your reaction. That is not weakness, that is strength." His words hung in the air, not as flattery, but as acknowledgement. the kind that stripped away invisibility. For the first time since boarding, Julian felt seen. He leaned back in his seat, listening as Richard's voice shifted from apology to possibility. This company is building a new initiative, a program to reshape how we approach marketing, to ensure that diversity and fairness are not just slogans, but guiding principles. We are looking for voices who understand what it means to be silenced and who can help us ensure it never happens again. Richard paused, then added with quiet weight, "Julian, I want you to be part of that program." Caleb's hand tightened around his partner's, the gesture filled with emotion. The humiliation they had endured moments ago was still raw, but now it carried a strange and unexpected edge: hope. Out of the ashes of insult came an opening that neither of them had foreseen. The cheap plastic tray, once a symbol of shame, now sat between them as the marker of a turning point. The cabin stirred again. A man in the back row murmured something under his breath. A woman tapped her phone as if memorializing what had unfolded. But the real shift was not in the whispers or the glances. It was in the recognition that dignity had been restored publicly, that a wrong had been acknowledged and found answered before the same eyes that had witnessed the harm. Julian met Richard's gaze, still processing the weight of the moment. It was not only about an apology, nor even about the opportunity being offered. It was about reclaiming something stolen from him in silence, his right to belong in any space he had earned. Caleb's eyes glistened, pride radiating in the way he held his partner's hand tighter, as if to say, we came in expecting only a journey, and instead found a battle worth fighting. The lesson lay not only in Richard's authority, but in Julian's restraint. Power can humiliate, but dignity disarms it. What unfolded in that cabin revealed that justice sometimes emerges not in sweeping victories, but in the quiet recognition of worth that prejudice tries to erase. True change does not begin with speeches on grand stages. It begins in the choice of individuals to treat one another as equals, even when the world encourages them to look away. When the wheels touched the runway and the aircraft rolled to a halt, the hum of the engine seemed gentler than before. Passengers rose from their seats, stretching, collecting bags, whispering about the incident that had unfolded high above the clouds. Julian Hart and Caleb Monroe remained seated for a moment, their hands still clasped together. The tension of the flight now dissolving into exhaustion. What had begun as a nightmarish humiliation had been turned upside down before their eyes. Richard Morrison lingered until the crowd thinned. He approached with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the commanding tone he had used earlier. "Julian," he said quietly, waiting until their eyes met, "there is something you should know. I believe in honesty, even when it stings." Julian straightened, sensing the weight in Richard's voice. Caleb leaned closer, his presence steady beside him. Richard continued, his expression one of regret. "Last year, I saw your application come across my desk, a role in corporate strategy. It impressed me, the ideas, the vision, the courage in your words. I made a note to follow up, but before I could, someone in human resources dismissed it. They wrote that you wouldn't fit the company culture." The phrase hung between them like an old wound being reopened. Julian's chest tightened. He remembered the rejection email, brief and sterile, with no explanation beyond polite dismissal. He had tried to move on, burying the sting, telling himself it was just another lost chance. To hear now that the truth was rooted not in his qualifications, but in prejudice that was a scar being traced in front of him. Richard's tone softened, carrying both apology and resolve. "That decision was wrong. It robbed you of an opportunity you earned. And after tonight, I will not let bias decide the future of this company again. I want to personally bring you back into consideration, not because of pity, but because I have seen your strength under fire. Strength like that is what this company needs." Caleb turned to Julian, his eyes wide with pride. For years, they had endured doors closed without reason, interviews ending with polite smiles that concealed rejection. Tonight, justice had circled back in the most unexpected place, a crowded airplane cabin turned courtroom, where prejudice had been exposed under fluorescent lights. Julian felt something shift inside him. It was not just vindication, it was the quiet reclamation of a piece of himself he had thought forever lost. To be told, in front of witnesses and now in private, that his worth had been misjudged because of who he was, and to see the cycle break in real time, it felt like standing at the edge of something new. He lifted his phone and dialed his mother. When her voice answered, he spoke with a steadiness that carried both pride and relief. "Tonight, Caleb and I are not only celebrating our love," he told her, "we are celebrating fairness finally being restored." His words carried more than personal victory. They were the declaration of a truth larger than himself. The lesson carved itself clearly from the night's ordeal. Dignity cannot be handed down by others. It must be recognized, defended, and lived. Prejudice may try to steal it, but justice, when it arrives, reminds the world that no one has the right to decide who belongs and who does not. In the silence of bystanders, in the courage of a single voice rising, the true measure of fairness is revealed. Now the story turns to you. If you were seated in that cabin, watching prejudice unfold in front of your eyes, would you have spoken up? Or would silence have tied your tongue? Tell us in the comments below what you would have done, and if you believe that every person deserves fairness and respect, no matter who they love. Comment the word respect right now. Don't forget to follow Hart Stories for more powerful, true-to-life stories that remind us why dignity, justice, and love are worth defending.